Okay, I can see everyone is on pins and needles right now. So I think we're going to go ahead and get underway. Welcome, everyone. My name is Tim Brown. I'm the director here at Hillyer, and I'm very excited today because we are featuring this month's featured artists in a live discussion about their art and work. Before we begin, let me just explain the outline for today's program. We're going to give each artist an opportunity to talk about their art. And at the end, we're going to reserve some opportunity for you to ask questions. If you have some questions early on, feel free to post them in the chat and we can refer to them later on. I want to introduce a couple people on staff who are joining me, who are going to be assisting with this program. Cassandra Bartlett, a gallery assistant. She's waving to you there. She's going to be introducing the artist. And Danielle Leisman is going to be facilitating discussions in the chat. But once again, welcome, and I hope you enjoyed today's program. I'm going to now introduce Cassandra Bartlett, who's going to introduce today's speakers. Okay, Cassandra.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, it's a huge pleasure being able to introduce the artists and to have so many people here today who are in support of our current exhibits and these talented artists' works. So right now, I'm going to start off. Actually, we're going to rearrange since we're still missing a single artist. So I'm going to start off by introducing our weaver in the gallery, Hillary Steele. She's going to dive in a little bit more on her current exhibit, that is Tikkun Olam, Repair the World. And Hillary, you can tell me if I said that all right this time. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Hillary Steele. Thank you.
Okay, greetings everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm going to share my screen. We good, Tim?
Yes.
Okay, I'm Hillary Steele. I'm a weaver and a dyer, and I hope if you haven't been to the gallery, you can get there. Otherwise, we will supply you, certainly with photos. Just ask. So, as Cassie said, the title of my exhibit is Tikkun Olam, which translates to Repair the World. And I'll address that a little bit, but a lot of people were asking me about process, so I decided to really focus on that and then some of the work that I've done leading up to the current work that's on exhibit. Behind me is my floor loom. That's my main tool that I use in my studio. I've got 3 of them. So, but I also, when I work in Mexico, which I'll talk about, I've been doing for the past 15 years, I work on a body tension loom called a backstrap loom. So that's pictured here as well. So those are tools. There's lots of different types of looms. They all basically function the same way. And as I said, I'm a weaver first. That's how I was trained back in the very early 80s as a weaver. And just by weaving alone, one can make incredibly beautiful things and explore the medium for one's whole life. But as it turned out, I became, before I say that, so just working with a floor loom, you can do lots of loom controlled patterns and work with complex weave structures. So that's just kind of knowing the loom and how it can function. So these are just examples of early work of mine and mid-career work where I'm just focused on controlling the loom and the warp and the weft. So weaving, you go back for a second, realize it's a 2-element system. You've got 2 sets of threads that interlace. That's how all cloth, woven cloth is made. You've got the warp threads that are under tension and then the weft threads that go over and under the warp threads. Early on after learning, I became intrigued with other types of cloth that utilize dyeing methods to embellish either the threads or the cloth itself. So these are pre-weaving techniques and post-weaving techniques. And I'm going to give you a little bit of an intro to that. So, and you'll see, if you come to the gallery, you'll see the labels ikat and shibori on a lot of my pieces, and sometimes I use them in tandem. So these are examples of cloth from various places: Japan, India, Uzbekistan. I've been fortunate to travel as well and learn from master weavers and artisans. Ikat is a pre-weaving technique. So it deals entirely with the threads. Now, it could be the warp threads, or it could be the weft threads, or it could be both. But it's a system, it's like tie-dyeing, except you don't have the cloth yet. So we use bundles of thread, and then we group them. We bind them very, very tightly with some sort of material that's going to resist the dye, because this is next going to be immersed into dye. And these are examples from a workshop I did with an Uzbeki master weaver. So these threads go in and out, and this is the warp, which are really like the bones of a woven piece of cloth. So these go in and out of dye pots. You can layer different colors. We remove some of the binds to expose undyed areas. Then we might put it in another color. We might rebind things in between to protect areas, and we build pattern into the threads. Sorry. So right here, you see on the left, that's that same warp. After all the dyeing has been done, you could see the pattern is just on the threads. Next, it goes to a loom. This happens to be a loom that's used in Peru. And the cloth is then woven. And that's a piece that I did in Mexico all the way to the right, which also, these are all ikat. Ikat has different names depending on where you are in the world. So the dye is, or the pattern is embedded into the thread, and the cloth is not made, and the pattern really appears when the cloth is woven. So it's really a pre-weaving, and it's a weaver's art form. And I would believe that all tie-dyed stuff really stems from ikat originally. Shibori and planji, shibori is a Japanese word, is also known in the States as tie-dye, but there's many different ways to take an existing piece of cloth. So this is post-weaving, and compress it, sew it, fold it in some way where you protect the undyed areas of the cloth, and then the exposed areas take dye. So you're looking at examples of some stitch resist, some folded resist from West Africa, and stitch resist from Mexico and Cameroon on the right. Other examples of resist dye are putting wax or paste on a cloth. You can paint that or apply it in different ways, like printing. That's called wax resist. So resist techniques, there's a big family of resist techniques. So in my work, it's really a combination, culled over many years now, many decades, of using complex loom-controlled woven structures and resist dye processes. This is a large piece of mine that was made in 2012, I believe, called Tells. And this was right at a transition when I started working dimensionally. This is all ikat. The piece on the left is called Spirit, and that is just ikat that's done in the warp. So again, pre-dyeing before the cloth is woven. And the piece on the right is from the mid-90s. It's a textile called Us, and that is all shibori. So the cloth was woven first, and then I manipulated the cloth to add the design. Later, other pieces I do, this is from a series called Intimates, where I combine both ikat and shibori. So again, I embed, and complex woven structures. So I embed patterns into the threads first, in the warp and in the weft, often on these pieces. I weave the cloth and I take it off the loom and I submerge it many, many more times into dye to shift the surface and to shift the color. So I work with color quite a bit too through dyes, which would be my medium. These are a little bit, give you a little bit closer look at complex weave structures on the loom. So again, I'm manipulating the warp threads so they make these just more complex structures, and I'm combining it with ikat or later with shibori. This is an early piece. This is actually the first piece on the left called Paciencia, which just translates to patience. where I used complex woven structures along with ikat. In the gallery, you'll see newer work. This is Tikkun Olam, Repair the World. This is the newest piece, just finished right before we hung the show. And on the right is a piece called Losses. Both of these pieces and much of the work in the exhibit right now is really showcasing my great concern about the state of our world nationally and internationally. Repair the World is really a call for exactly that, which would include dialogue, honest dialogue, and calm dialogue with each other, and respectful dialogue. And to the right, Losses is really a reflection of my deep, and I know I share this with lots of people, sadness, I guess, about gun violence, and particularly globally, but in America, and the loss of lives. And particularly, I'm a teacher, so I've been talking to students about this for a really long time already, and it just doesn't end. So I weave a lot of cloth. Then once it comes off the loom, I cut it off. I cut it into pieces. I manipulate it. I fold it, and stuff's become more dimensional and more angular. When cloth comes off the loom, it's rectangular. So it depends on the width that I weave it in. So that gives you a little bit of insight into what I'm doing, but I have been incredibly lucky to have learned from fabulous people and have met incredible mentors who've really stayed in contact with me through my whole career and made quite an impression on me. In return, I am a teacher as well, and now I know I have to step up since my mentors are starting to pass away and pass on what I've learned. A lot of the work I study is endangered. There's a huge loss of knowledge, or if things are still being practiced, they're much simpler than the way that they were practiced originally. Textiles goes back thousands and thousands of years, so I really believe this is in our DNA. And there's lots of rewards in learning how to work with one's hands, no matter what your field is. I've traveled for many years, and what I've seen, and the image on the left is a fellow in Côte d'Ivoire, where I went in the early 90s to study with the baoulé weavers, who also do resist techniques, ikat. Children would just be present. They would just learn next to their relatives, typically, whether it was ceramics or metalwork or weaving in this case, and they would just be given materials to hold and be present, and they would absorb the process as they grew up. We are so far away from that in our culture that I think that, and the work is not really valued so much anymore. I teach all my students how to weave and how to do other textile processes, again, because I really believe how that's crazy important for us to understand our human history and the evolution of these processes and the power and the importance they have in various societies. That's another conversation. Up at the top right is a dear friend and mentor of mine, Virginia Davis, who I met at the Penland School in North Carolina in probably the mid 80s. She and I have collaborated together for many decades, and she's the reason I ended up in Mexico. So let me tell you a little bit about what I'm doing in Mexico and current projects that are on my plate, and I hope to finish at some point soon. I started going to Mexico first to explore the jaspe rebozo. Rebozo is an important cultural garment. It's a shawl, and it figures in poetry and music from the time of birth, celebratory times, and also at the time of death. And the jaspe rebozo has ikat in it. So jaspe is the term for ikat that's used in the Americas, or part of the Americas. I've also been fortunate to be pointed in the direction of a researcher who worked in the area in Mexico that I work in, near Tenancingo, Mexico, which is in the state of Mexico. Elsie McDougall, her archives are in New York City at the Museum of Natural History there. She documented weavers in a barrio very close to where I work in the 1930s. My teacher, Don Evaristo Borboa Casas, was a little kid running around there. And he, as I went through her archives, I realized he taught us exactly the stuff that she was documenting in the 1930s. So this is a detail of actually a piece that I'm working on now, or not working on because I haven't had time, on the right in Mexico currently. So, and in short, here's an up-close view of how they work in Mexico. Same technique, ikat or jaspe. We start with white thread, only it is, the warp is wound, it's bundled, it's starched, then it is stretched out very, very tightly. We draw patterns on it, and then we bind the threads according to the patterns all the way down the length of the warp. It's very labor-intensive work. And again, the binding protects the groups of thread from the dye. Once the dyeing is done, we, and the difference in the lengths here you're seeing is because one is prepared for the backstrap loom. You only do one piece at a time. And these are also woven on floor looms. So they do multiples there. Once the dyeing is done, the binds are removed. And then you can see the warp, one warp stretched out on the bottom of the screen. And you can see the contrast between the dyed and what was then the protected areas. Next, it goes to the weavers. This is my friend who I'm working with right now, Ruben Nunez, and he is intent on keeping me involved and teaching me. Don Evaristo on the right, who passed away in December of 2020, and that's who I worked with most of the time, and Ruben worked with him as well. So we are continuing to learn. I've got 15 years in, and I probably need another 10 at least. So I also continue to teach. I teach students around here, but I also teach sometimes around nationally and also internationally. These are students in Mexico. And I was, as I've been researching this, I brought this to Oaxaca, where you don't see the ikat that much, and taught them just what Don Evaristo was teaching me. And on the right is work that was on my loom. So I really am pretty well versed in these global techniques. And then I bring this into my studio and I really interpret it for my own equipment and through my own contemporary lens. So this is probably the next piece that will be, I'll be working on. The cloth is already woven and we'll see what I do with it. So thank you so much for listening. I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Hillary, for the amazing presentation and the rich history that goes into your works. I never knew how much went involved in that, but it's spectacular. Thank you. So next up, we're going to have our other artist in the gallery, one of our other two artists in the gallery, Michael Thron, who's also going to be speaking with you all. His works are the large-scale installation that whenever you visit the gallery, if you've already been in, it's the first space that you would enter, mixed media and a good conversation starter. So please join me in welcoming Michael Thron. Michael, go ahead.
Hi, how's everyone doing? Sorry I was a little late. I was actually at a site visit trying to get a site working for a big sculpture that I have in the works. But I'd like to talk, but here I want to talk about the work I have at Hillyer, which is an exhibition called In the Ways. Just kind of start off is, before I get into kind of what In the Ways means and the work that I did for the show. So I grew up in Stamford, Connecticut on the Long Island Sound and kind of grew up as like as a waterman. I kind of grew up fishing and hunting on the coast, coastal foraging, spear fishing every once in a while, just like really like the Long Island Sound or the Atlantic or just the water of New England was very, very important to my upbringing. And in the last couple of years, my art has been focused on climate change and specifically the rising tides. I don't have a photo with me right now. It was just like I just jumped right in of the works. I don't know if maybe Tim has a photo or someone else has a photo they can throw up. So the term In the Ways is a term used when a ship is either under construction or being repaired. And most of the times almost all the times in that situation, the boat is brought into a skipway or skidway and is put onto stilts or put up and brought out of the water to be repaired and kind of like fixed or even be built. So the whole boat is being shown. So with the two ship-like hull pieces, they're made of tin, lead, and aluminum. The tin and lead was actually harvested from two churches in Virginia, where I was able to acquire all the old lead and tin organ pipes and started processing that as a material. Just I like not so much trying to bring the idea of church or God into it, but I was more interested in how lead, which is a material that's been used for 1,000 years, is now seen as this very deadly and scary and horrible material. And in the right circumstances, lead is a very dangerous material, especially how it dissolves in water and what it can do to brain function, like in Flint, Michigan. So, but lead is a very useful material. I mean, originally old lead pipes, all like the pipes that used to be in New York City or even in old towns, where they would carve out logs, or they would cast these long pieces of cast iron pipe. They would have to be fused together, and they would usually fuse them with lead. And water back in the day was a lot less acidic. It was a lot less intrusive onto metals. So as the iron pipes rusted, the inside of those pipes would corrode and be covered in rust, which would seal off the lead. Well, as water companies start creating more acidic water, and as with acid rain and just like more pollution, the more acid in the water starts etching away at that rust. And because of that etching away, the lead is then revealed. And on that, when the lead is revealed being such a soft metal, that's how it's able to dissolve in the water. So because of climate change, it's affecting our water. So I like using lead a lot because of its history, but also its context nowadays as this deadly, horrible material, even though it's a material that's shaped so much of civilization around the world. The stands in the piece are actual sailboat stands that I salvaged from this harbor in Coscob, Connecticut, which is where I grew up. And there's this old harbor that's a bunch of the harbors along the coast are being bought out by these big land developers, and they're building these giant plastic skyscrapers where they can shove as many people in there. So all this history and these industries of small harbor towns are kind of being destroyed and uprooted to bring in just people to live, to ship down into New York City to do work. So the stands kind of for me are like become remnants of that. And the stands are steel, but they're coated in a copper anti-fouling agent, which an anti-fouling agent is what's painted on the bottom of boats nowadays to stop barnacles and bacteria from kind of growing and sticking and doing all the boats, because copper is antibacterial. So it's kind of and having it oxidized shows that passive time and how salt water affects that material. The outside of the ship hulls it's made out of that letter tin, but it's also riveted together. And riveting is a material I've been really interested in because it's most of my work in the past has been a very hot process. I do a lot of forging, I do a lot of fabrication and metal casting. But since leaving grad school 2 years ago, I haven't had access to these large shops to do these large metal pours or giant fabrications. So riveting has been a way for me to attach metal together through a cold process. And in this context, the old wooden ships, before there was anti-fouling paint and copper-based paint, that they would cover the bottom of ship holes in copper plates or copper flashing, and they would rivet them together. So kind of bringing the history of that process of shipbuilding into a modern way. The coating on these boat-like hulls is actually tar. On the left, the black is just a tar and sand mixture, and on the right is an aluminum powder mixed with tar and sand. These materials nowadays are basically used for, the aluminum is used for coating roofs to reflect light, to make buildings less hot, or just reflect the damage from the sun. And then the asphalt or the bitumen on the left is just used, wherever you kind of see asphalt, or even on those black tar roofs, So these are commonly used materials, but in the past, tar, even though it's a petroleum product, was a really, really important material. Like old pine tar kilns were very, very precious, because in between those wooden boards on ships, they would use caulking, but caulking not like silicone caulking as we know, but they would stuff cotton rope in between each of the boards, and then smear those boards with tar and burn them, and that would create a waterproof seal. And if, let's say, if you were out on the ocean and and all of a sudden there was a leak in your boat, you would always have some tar around, where you can take a thing of tar, smear it into that hole, and then burn it, and it could stop the leak, then thus saving on the ships. So I found tar to be an interesting material in the last couple of years in my work, because of its, depending on the time you look at it, it's either an important or destructive material. You look at history, it was a material that saved lives and built ships, and it was part of trade, and was part of transportation and exploration of the world. And then you look a little closer, and then you start seeing, people being tarred and feathered. It became a material of shame. And now tar is it's a petroleum-based product, so it's looped in with climate change and the effect on the world, and asphalt, and the black desert parking lots that are popping up more and more while land is getting destroyed. So it's become a very interesting material to use in art contexts, just because of when you look at it and how you look at it changes its purpose. The charcoal piece on the back was a late addition to the exhibition. And it started out as kind of an experiment, but it was kind of just doing something that I was taught in grad school, which was it was called a single stroke. And it was a project that I was taught, and then I would teach to my theory class, where it was like one of the final projects in the semester, where students had to make 5 paintings using one single stroke. The idea wasn't to make anything. It wasn't to try to make something you could recognize, but it was just to do a single gesture, as if someone was playing a single note on a violin, or it was just about to have just one single motion to show emotion. So using that, I created this weird device that kind of looks like a club, and it's covered in charcoal. And I started doing these long streaking motions and gestures, trying to create a form. And with that one, I just kept doing the same one and spinning the piece, and kind of created this almost like radar, ultrasound looking thing. And I'm still not really sure what it is, but I'm attracted to it, into the kind of the edges and all that. So, but yeah, so altogether, the piece, this piece is still kind of continuation of my work about climate change, the rising tides, and the work I'm trying to moving forward right now is kind of also in that same realm. I've done a lot of work with boat forms on stilts for the last couple of years, and I'm gonna start moving away from these stilted ideas of putting everything that we hold sacred above us for when the tides rise. So got a couple more experiments in the works, a couple more pieces coming up, and I'm excited to see what else I can share with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for your share. So we have one final artist who will give a talk today, and that is our painter in resident at the gallery, and that's MK Bailey. She just waved. Please join me in welcoming MK to listen to her about her current exhibit, Secret Garden.
Awesome. Thank you, Cassie. Could you put up a picture like you just did with Michael of okay, cool. Hi everyone, I'm MK Bailey. I'm a DC-based painter. I guess for my portion of the artist talk, I'll have Cassie put up a picture just so anyone who isn't familiar with the exhibit can kind of get an idea of what it looks like, what the figurative work that I'm doing right now is looking like. And then I actually have a few materials here so we can pin my screen, and I want to talk to you a little bit about materials. So this is my exhibit. It is 9 brand new paintings, super fresh. I call it Secret Garden. When people ask me what the theme is, I tell them the theme is gardening. and anxiety. So that's the general basis for all of these paintings. All the paintings are figurative pieces. So there's a single figure in all of them, and they're just kind of surrounded by different plants, a few different like architectural elements that you might see maybe if you were walking around DC. And I include these because they are literally things that I see while walking around my neighborhood, like wrought iron fence gates, lots and lots of trash, tulips, bars on windows, things like that. I'm really interested in the juxtaposition between like the beautiful flora and the really hard pieces of just things that you see in gardens, right? And like the implication of having bars on windows and trash and things like that. Okay, cool. Cassie, can you pin me so I can do a little show and tell of some things? I just want to talk about process a little bit because I'm in a very experimental point of my development as an artist. I guess I feel like I'm kind of moving into my more mature work. I finally know what I'm doing now. My work, I consider it split into 3 different categories. I have my drawings that I do on Procreate, which is an iPad app. It's literally you just have like a stylus and a canvas and you can do so many things with it. So yeah, I have my drawings. And then I have my landscape paintings, which you can see behind me are very off the cuff. I kind of have imagery that I use in a lot of different paintings, but I place the imagery in like different places to just like experiment with composition and color and things. And then I have my figurative work, which is a lot more planned. It also involves the drawings and takes the imagery that I use in my landscape paintings and kind of brings everything all together. So when I have a finished painting, what the process for that looks like is I start with an idea that has come from either some sort of media that I'm absorbing, like maybe a movie. I love period pieces, you can probably tell. I love music, song lyrics, maybe a dream that I had or something somebody said to me. So they, all the figurative pieces come from one of those ideas. I have a whole list that I just keep on my iPhone and the Notes app. Lots of really off the cuff thoughts that I'll eventually re-examine in my drawings. So I start with that. I actually normally name my pieces first, which I know that's like naming pieces is very divisive among artists. I don't know, I'd like to hear Michael and Hillary's thoughts about that during the discussion part for sure. But I actually love naming things. So I start with that and then I go to my digital drawings. They allow me to move really, really fast through the drawing and composing process. And then in order to bring the digital pieces into real life, I actually have these little, I kind of call them bridge paintings. They're very, very small in comparison to the actual paintings, which are 3 by 4 feet. So these are 11 by 18, and they are just tiny, very fast acrylic paintings that help me move the digital colors that are all, you know, backlit on my iPad into the real world, and they help me figure out those color relationships. I'm working in acrylic paint right now. I used to work mostly in oils. I have a very, very realistic painting background. I actually want to shout out 2 people in the audience right now, Jonathan Linton and Suzanne Lego Arthur. They have been with me through my journey from realism and oil painting into this new kind of contemporary thing that I'm doing. So hi guys, excited to see you later. But yeah, this is my bridge in between the digital drawings and the larger paintings. Just very, very quick, very getting the colors and values right, figuring out what colors I can actually achieve with my limited palette that I use. And then after this, I actually will project the different parts of my drawing onto the canvas and literally just layer every part on top of each other. And okay, also, so some of these drawings at this stage, these look very different than what actually ended up being in the exhibit. So I am still, not every single thing is done in the drawing stage. I still am experimenting a lot as I go. But yeah, so while I'm painting, I am very concerned with texture, both real and implied. So I use a lot of mediums in my acrylics to create different levels of opacity and transparency. So one of the biggest things that I use, I'm a big fan of GAC. Actually, this is not GAC, this is open gloss. So Jonathan actually gave me this, and this is like, slows down the acrylic process, makes it easier to do like really nice and smooth gradients. I also have a matte medium. I've been experimenting with sheen a lot recently. So that's for implied texture. But then I'm also working with literal texture in my paintings, and that's something that I started with these landscape paintings last year. It's hard to see on the Zoom call, but the words here have a raised texture to them that I apply with a palette knife. And in the paintings in the gallery, the figurative ones, there's also lots of texture in each painting. So I have these tiny little paint blobs that I saved for my palettes because I'm very concerned about color. So if a color isn't exactly right, I'm not going to use it. So I do end up with tiny little blobs of paint that I've started saving because, you know, us artists and our hoarding tendencies for this kind of stuff. I see Hillary like nodding her head, yes, yeah. But this is actually a really tactile example of the kind of texture that is in the paintings that I make. So it's just raised. I use a gel medium or molding paste to create a heavy enough acrylic so that it can stand up on its own. And yeah, I put this stuff down with the gel medium with a palette knife so that it's very, a lot easier to manipulate than with a brush. But yeah, that's it for my materials talk. I think Q&A next. Okay, awesome. Thanks, y'all.
All right, thank you so much, MK. And to take care of the Q&A portion of it, I wanted to reintroduce the other gallery attendant here today, Dan. So please be supportive and think of those good questions that you've had with all of the huge insight you just received. We would love to hear them.
I am patiently waiting for your questions to come in. While they do, I actually have a question for Hillary about a certain, so you said the ikat, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah.
Method. Is that what is used in the atlas fabric that is from like the Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Xinjiang area? Is that the same method that's used for that type of fabric?
Yes,
Okay.
but the atlas fabric refers to the combination of the materials. I can't remember off the top of my head. One is alt cotton and one is cotton and silk. And they're also worn by either men or women. So, but it is the ikat technique, and in Uzbekistan, it's called abraband, which means tying clouds or cloud tying. That's what it translates to. But that's the ikat technique, same thing. And in that region of China as well, I don't know what it's called, but yep, same technique. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
That's a great question.
I love the imagery of cloud tying.
Mm-hmm.
That really makes me think. That's so beautiful.
What I love about studying this, like the more you study it, you can, you know, if you see the ikat fabric, and ikat's the Malaysian word. So that's kind of the universal term, but every place has its own name for it. You can start to pick out where the work came from, where it was made, because every place has its own aesthetic. You know, some stuff is large and grand, certain colors are used. Some stuff is like the stuff in Mexico is really, really tiny little resist. And it's always, some people are playing around with it, but generally it's just dyed once. So it's, you know, white and whatever color it's dyed in. So the West African stuff, which is an early love of mine, is just very bold and graphic. So it's fun. The Japanese stuff is fabulous. That's called kusuri. So anyway.
Hillary, how do you make your dyes? What do you use?
I mostly use chemical dyes. I do use natural dyes sometimes. In some of the work, there's indigo that I use, and I'm starting to play around with cochineal as well. But because I work really large and I've been doing it for a long time, and some of my work has gone to various places, I was always very concerned with the light fastness of the dyes. So very early on, I researched that, and that's why I use synthetic dyes. So I use mostly Procyon dyes. I worked with wool years and years ago, and I used acid dyes for that. So it depends again on the fiber that you're using.
Yeah, that's amazing. It sounds like you just have this incredible base of knowledge about like all aspects of...
Well, I have probably close to 40 years in, so we accumulate as we get older. But, you know, it's like any of the fields we're in, we're always continually learning things and expanding, you know, building on the knowledge base we have, right? And then you get different ideas based on what you see out there, what you know, and you can kind of just expand the repertoire. So, you know, learning, I mean, just keep it staying in the game. It's always engaging because there's always more to learn, I find.
Absolutely. Yeah, when I moved from oil to acrylic, which was really only 2 years ago, that did, in my head, I was like, okay, I have to learn a whole new set of like archivalness and light fastness, and it's just, yeah, learning about how to best make the work is also a whole other part of art. I guess there's a question in the chat about what the hardest part of this exhibit was. For me, it was the turnaround time. I developed and made this body of work in 3 months. So that was, it was very difficult. It's probably the most challenging thing that I have done professionally so far, but it was also really rewarding because I had an excuse to just like fully immerse myself in this. And I actually was wondering with Michael and Hillary, we were all chosen for solo shows that were supposed to be in 2020. And, you know, here we are 2 years later. Did you all show the work that you proposed at that point, or did you make a completely different thing? Like, I'd love to hear what you all did.
Yeah, I completely did something different than what I proposed. What I proposed was work that was a lot more fragile. It was going to be these giant plaster casts of certain type of negative spaces of draped fabric that actually would have worked really well with yours, Hillary. But that's when I had a studio that was 20 minutes down the road, and where I was working on these pieces for the last couple of months. I've been pretty much every month I've been in a different location since last October. So the work I made was mainly made in Connecticut. And one of the most challenging things was getting these giant things down to Maryland, which was like a caravan of cars, some with just with just the big boat forms. Another car just had the stands. And so that was challenging. One of the more rewarding things was this was actually my first time I ever put up a 2D form of artwork. I've never exhibited anything two-dimensional ever. So, and I think it actually kind of helped make the exhibition for me. So that was probably the most rewarding thing, was doing something 2D, or exhibiting something 2D and it feeling successful, because I never felt anything I did in 2D was good, actually.
So I was supposed to have a show in 2021. I think January of 2021 I was slated for. My work takes a really long time to make. So, but I did start, I was so thrilled to have that opportunity. And I did make a number of the pieces that are in the show were made with the Hillyer in mind. Sheltered, Losses, Requiem. I think there's Swallowed Up, another one. So a bulk of them. Tikkun Olam, I maybe had started, I don't know how long. I can't remember when I started making the fabric. I have to find my notebook because it's written down somewhere. So I did show a couple of those pieces in Bethesda. I had an opportunity to have a show with a friend this past fall. So that was the first time some of those were out. I think Sheltered was in DC for right when COVID hit too. But yeah, but I just kept Tikkun Olam never would have been done had the show progressed as planned. So I finished it. I took it off the wall a little reluctantly to bring it to the gallery to hang it. And we had to my husband makes frames for me. And that was quite the chore. So I had spring break from school and it was continuous work for those last 2 weeks. And a lot of that piece had been sewn together already, but there's always more stuff to do. I'm sure you guys experience that as well. You know, you get it in your mind, it's kind of done, but then, you know, when you have to take it out of your studio, it's not quite done. There's something that needs attending to. So, yeah. So I haven't even had that one photographed yet because I didn't have time. So it was a lot. Yeah, I think we were all a little bit under the gun, but thank you for reopening, Hillyer, because it's really nice. I think we're all kind of overlapping in, you know, some of our concerns and what the work's about too, which is interesting to me.
We are starting to get some questions. I have a question for MK from Kate. She says, can you speak a little bit about the figures in your work? Where do they come from and what do they mean?
Well, thank you, Kate. That's a good question. Yeah, so the figures in my work, I have a really realistic background. I did life drawing courses for like years. I love drawing the figure, painting the figure. It's really rewarding for me. And my thesis show in college was actually a series of self-portraits. And I kind of got tired of using my own image. So I was like, okay, how can I have kind of like a stand-in for me? Because all of my paintings are about like my experiences, right? So that's when I started playing around with using different stand-ins. I started with statues and those weren't particularly rewarding. That was a very short series with the statues. I felt like I exhausted those very quickly, but now I'm on to kind of the classical European canon figures, very articulated gestures, beautiful hand placement. I'm exploring a lot of those, so like Bouguereau and Rubens and such. They're all stand-ins for me. I consider all of my paintings self-portraits, even though they don't actually have me in them.
Thanks for that.
Thank you, Kate.
Michael, here's a question for you. I love the way you dig into the meaning behind your materials. Thanks for sharing that in your talk. You mentioned that you process the organ pipes from the church for these pieces. Can you elaborate on what this means?
So like when I first got the pipes, they were ranging from, you know, about 6 inches and a half inch wide to kind of 10 feet and a foot wide, because they need the whole spectrum of each of the octaves. So me and a friend, Jeremy Kunkel, got in contact with these people who had two entire church organs. So he's a wood guy and I'm a metal guy. So we divided. So he had the entire wood ones, which he actually ended up doing his thesis. And those are equally sized. Some of those organs are a foot by a foot. And so what I started doing to process them is I started kind of brutally tearing them apart and cutting down their lead seams, ripping them open, and I made these jigs that allowed me to flatten large pieces of lead, where it was a kind of a cone shape that would slowly open it, because if I did it too quickly, the lead would rip. And like actually with lead and tin, you can, if you get a good grip and the right leverage, you can kind of just rip that type of metal in half like a piece of paper. And so it was being very gentle but forceful to kind of create these very large planes, just as like almost usable plies. And each of the lead and tin, some of them were covered in like copper leaf and gold leaf, and some of them had been painted. And these organs were like 100-something years old, so they were super fragile to begin with. So it was like a mixture of being very gentle and forceful. And then once the lead was kind of flattened out, there was all these different ridges and shapes, and I was about kind of almost processing these pipes as if you would do like a wild game, and kind of like taking off the trim and making it into just usable rectangles that can be cut or formed and shaped to anything.
Great.
Thank you for the question.
I think we have time for one more. Hillary, I've got one for you. I would like to know if you can speak a little bit about the wooden hanging structures that support your work.
Sure. Some of them are really quite beautiful without my fabric on them. So it's challenging. My husband, Richard O'Connor, does woodwork and is getting better and better at it, especially since he retired. So, and there's a shop outside of our house that he works in. So, and I choose generally, he's taught me a lot about wood, and I choose the wood really depending on the color it's going to take when it's finished to go with the textile. So the one in the gallery is sapele. Others are cherry, some are oak. And it's quite challenging for my husband because textile is flexible and wood is not. So I make drawings which are inaccurate as best because I pin everything to the wall. I try and measure things, measurements shift and change as I repin or take the textile off. And we just sort of, make our way through it. Sometimes he'll just make a mock-up with other kinds of wood, just out of pine until we figure it out. And then we've developed a system of hanging the pieces. So the textile all comes off of it. The frames break down into parts, and then we can hang them separately and then put the textile on it. And that's been very satisfying because years ago, my older work just had rods. And then Rich would sometimes make just a simple wooden frame that went up on the wall, like just a piece, and then the piece would hang off of that. But my work's been getting more complicated. So I have promised him to go backward to older work that's way more simple and not burden him with this so much. So, and that piece I intended to be much more sculptural. We just really did not have the time to make a frame and pull that off. So we'll see down the road.
That piece is so stunning, Hillary. It's really incredible. The frames are just, it's so beautiful. It really complements the work really well. And I work in exhibits and hanging. So the first thing I noticed was the hanging structures for your work and was like, whoa, that is nice.
I hope my husband's listening because I tell him the same thing. And the ones that are incredibly beautiful is Sheltered, which is pretty complicated how that one goes together, and also Losses, which I just, sometimes I give him this strange old drawing that I can understand, but it's really hard to translate. And again, the material is so different from the material I'm working in. So thank you. I agree.
Well, thank you to our artists. Thank you for everybody for your wonderful questions. Tim, I'm gonna hand things off to you.
I want to take this opportunity to thank the artists. This is very special for me, especially since I came in, I guess, last fall. And my main job was to reopen the gallery. And I did not have an exhibition schedule in place. And I came up with the decision to revisit the artists who were originally scheduled to have exhibitions a year or two ago. And at first, I wasn't quite sure how this was going to materialize. And I was pleasantly surprised by how receptive all of the artists were, and made putting the schedule of exhibitions together so much easier than it could have been. So I really, really appreciate everything that you've done in preparation for the exhibition. Clearly, you've given a lot of thought and energy to them. The exhibitions look amazing, and I'm sure everyone would agree. And if you haven't seen the exhibition yet, the exhibitions will be on view through May 1st. I also want to take this time to acknowledge the National Endowment for the Arts. They do support some of our programs, so I think it's important to mention that. And before we wrap up, I would like, if you can, to provide some feedback about this program. We hope to offer more programs like this in the future. And so I created a short little poll. So if you could fill this out before you leave, that would be great. I want to thank all of you for coming to this program this evening. I definitely want to thank the staff, Cassie and Danielle, for helping out. I hope you have a great day. I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll now. You should be able to see it on the screen. If you could take some time to fill that out, that'll be great.